A black man parked for just 7 minutes. Then everything changed. No shouting, no resistance, just one still figure and one furious sheriff unraveling on camera. What followed exposed a buried confession, a silent witness, and a truth too heavy to hide. This isn't just a story, it's a reckoning. Watch until the end, and if it moves you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more real stories that cut deeper than headlines. He had been parked for just 7 minutes. The midday sun stretched over the cracked concrete of an aging rest stop where vending machines buzzed and tired travelers shuffled in and out, chasing caffeine or a quiet moment. Elijah Sorrell wasn't in a rush. He never was. With the precision of someone who understood time differently, he had pulled into the lot, backed into a shaded space beneath a dying oak, and turned off the engine. His car, a midnight blue sedan with clean lines and Virginia plates, idled for a few seconds longer before going still. Inside, he sat motionless. No music, no phone, just a man resting in transit. That was enough. Sheriff Damon Kreel saw the vehicle before he saw the man. A stranger's car, out-of-state plates, black driver. That was all the math he needed. The equation didn't care about character. It didn't wait for nuance. Kreel's patrol cruiser jerked into motion like a predator catching scent. Tires groaned as he maneuvered across the lot and pulled up directly behind Elijah's car, boxing him in. No sirens, no lights, just quiet assertion. At first, Elijah didn't move. Through the mirror, he saw the sheriff step out, hand on his belt, face already tight with suspicion. Kreel approached like he was expecting a fight, like he wanted one. His fingers drummed once on the hood before rounding to the driver's side window. He didn't knock. He pounded. 3 times. Authority, not courtesy. Elijah rolled down the window halfway. Not because he had to, not out of fear, just enough for air and accountability. "What's your business here?" Kreel barked. Elijah looked at him. Not through him, not around him. At him. "Resting," he said. Kreel's face twisted. "You think I'm stupid?" Silence. "You think you can just roll into my county, park like you own the place, and sit there like some watcher?" His voice cracked with performative volume. His fingers twitched near the holster, not drawing, just dancing near the edge. A theater of power. And all Elijah did was blink, slow and deliberate, the kind of blink that refuses to play along. Kreel yanked the door open without warning. Elijah didn't flinch, didn't resist. He handed over his identification, calm and smooth, movements clean enough to be choreographed. Kreel snatched the wallet, rifled through it like it had insulted him, then flung it into the air. Cards scattered across the asphalt like confetti at a parade no one had consented to attend. "Don't move unless you want a bullet," he hissed, fingers stabbing toward Elijah's forehead as if punctuating his own lack of control. The line wasn't protocol. It wasn't law. It was ego trying to find traction. A few people had started watching from a distance. A man with a toddler. A couple sitting in a pickup with a dog pressed against the back window. A teenage girl with a phone in her hand, red recording light barely visible from 20 feet away. Kreel didn't care. Or maybe he did, but too late. "You people think cameras protect you," he spat, voice rising. "Think again. You people." 2 words, heavy as lead, said with the casual cruelty of someone who'd never been made to answer for them. Elijah didn't react. His eyes didn't flash. His mouth didn't twitch. He didn't reach for his ID or defend his presence or remind the sheriff that he had rights. He didn't need to. His stillness was indictment enough. Kreel's frustration bloomed. His body coiled and uncoiled, his hands flexed like pistons, trying to keep pace with a crumbling engine. For a man so used to dominance, the absence of fear felt like an insult. "I'm interfering with an officer now," Elijah finally said, the calm in his voice deliberate and unsettling. "By sitting still?" It wasn't a challenge, it was an observation. Kreel leaned in closer, eyes wild. "You think your past matters now?" And that was the slip. The fracture in the performance. Because Kreel knew who he was talking to. Not just a stranger with an out-of-state license, but Elijah Sorrell, the same man who had once advised federal ethics boards, the same man who disappeared from headlines years ago, who now moved like shadow, precise and unseen. But ego has a short memory and a loud mouth. Kreel didn't stop. "Let me explain something," he growled. "This is my town, my name, my rules. You don't scare me." And then, for a beat, silence stretched between them. Elijah met his gaze, not defiantly, not passively, just exactly. His eyes held no threat, only awareness, and Kreel saw it. Maybe not consciously, but in the part of himself that still understood consequence, he saw it. Elijah bent down slowly, gathered his scattered ID cards from the ground, dusted them off one by one, and slid them back into his wallet. His movements were unhurried, ceremonial almost. Around them, the parking lot was unnaturally quiet. The vending machines still buzzed. The trees still rustled. But the air felt charged. Not with danger. With exposure. Kreel looked around, saw the phones now clearly raised, lenses aimed like moral rifles. His breath caught. His swagger faltered. And his next move wasn't to arrest, to cite, or to escalate. It was to retreat. He slammed the door shut, stomped back to his cruiser, and peeled away. Not like a victor, but like a man trying to outrun a shadow he couldn't name. The dust hadn't settled before someone approached Elijah. A man, maybe in his 40s, offered a bottle of water. Elijah declined with a nod. The teenage girl was still recording. She didn't ask for a statement. She didn't need one, because sometimes the loudest line in a confrontation isn't shouted. It's shown. 7 minutes. That's all it took to expose a crack in the facade. To show how prejudice wrapped in a badge unravels the moment it faces someone who refuses to flinch. And this was only the beginning. Power is loud when it's afraid. That's what the cameras caught next. Not justice, not law, but the noise of a man unraveling. Sheriff Damon Kreel had pulled away from the rest stop parking lot with his tires screeching, as if trying to leave behind the moment he'd just manufactured. But the silence he tried to flee didn't stay in that lot. It followed him. Because what had just happened wasn't a routine stop. It was a rupture. And it started not with defiance, but with stillness. Elijah Sorrell hadn't said much, barely moved. And yet, every inch of his calm was louder than Kreel's entire performance. He hadn't needed to raise his voice, because the truth doesn't need volume to strike. All Elijah had done was look, straight ahead, eyes steady, unshaken. And that alone had stripped the sheriff's badge of its camouflage. Stripped it down to what it had become. A shield for fear. What the cameras captured in the minutes that followed wasn't about Elijah. It was about Kreel, about a man who'd spent too long speaking without being questioned, threatening without consequence, wearing a uniform that had never truly fit. The footage spread fast. In 3 hours, over 50,000 views. By nightfall, 2 local stations had cut together the clips with somber voiceovers. But the raw video, unedited, unfiltered, just Kreel's voice cracking over Elijah's silence, was the one that resonated. Because in that footage, power didn't look brave. It looked small. People couldn't stop talking about it. Not because of what was shouted, but because of what wasn't. They saw the flung ID, the jabbing finger, the loud command, "Don't move unless you want a bullet." And then they saw the man not moving, not blinking, not flinching, just being. It shook something loose. In the sheriff, in the viewers, maybe even in the air itself. Because stillness, when done with purpose, isn't passive. It's sharp. It's precise. It holds up a mirror to chaos and forces it to confront itself. And Elijah, sitting in the car with both hands visible, didn't just sit for his own safety. He sat with intent, not frozen by fear, not paralyzed, but grounded, so thoroughly present that Kreel didn't know how to respond. Because men like Kreel weren't trained to handle calm. They were trained to fight noise, and Elijah gave him none. Witnesses later described the mood as surreal, tense, like watching two storms move in opposite directions. One woman, who had stayed parked 2 rows away, would later post on social media, "I've never seen someone more in control without saying a word. The officer was yelling. The other man, he didn't even blink. It was like the badge meant nothing, and the truth was already decided." And maybe it was. Kreel returned to the station that day in a storm of indignation, barking at staff, demanding access to any surveillance angles from the rest stop, even though several civilian videos had already gone viral. His deputy, Officer Lorna Hess, quietly stepped out of his path when he entered. She'd seen that look before, when noise couldn't drown out consequence. He was pacing, she later recalled, cussing, talking about how they're all ganging up now, but I think deep down he knew he'd crossed a line. Not legally, not yet, but something subtler. The kind of line you feel in your bones the moment it's gone. The kind that doesn't mark territory. The kind that marks shame. And meanwhile, Elijah, he never posted a word, never spoke to a camera, never responded to interview requests or social media tags. He drove away from the rest stop 20 minutes after Kreel had left. No fanfare, no headline, just the hum of his engine against the setting sun. But the moment lived on. Because what Elijah had done, what no one else had thought to do, was turn stillness into a form of confrontation. And not the explosive kind. The kind that says, "I see you. I see what you're doing. And I refuse to give you what you want." It's a tactic rarely taught, but deeply understood by those who've been on the wrong side of power too many times. Don't shout. Don't panic. Don't resist in the way they expect. Just exist so fully that your very presence exposes the weakness in theirs. Kreel's rage wasn't about the ID, or the car, or the plates. It was about the control he couldn't assert, the performance that had failed. In his world, silence was supposed to equal submission. But Elijah had flipped that script. His silence wasn't fear. It was containment. It was command. And Kreel, for all his bark and noise, had nothing that could match it. That was the real threat. Not Elijah's voice, but his refusal to use it. The local sheriff's office issued no statement in the first 48 hours. But inside, phones were ringing. Emails piled up. People wanted answers, not about procedure, but about behavior, about dignity, about how a man sworn to protect had instead performed like a man threatened by calm. And perhaps the most damning footage wasn't the shouting or the flung ID. It was that 3-second stretch where Kreel paused, where his voice caught, where his face changed just slightly when Elijah didn't speak back. That was the tell, the moment of unraveling, when a badge looked less like protection and more like armor without a soul inside it. That footage was replayed on loop, slowed down, analyzed, even narrated by public figures. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was real. Because it wasn't an outburst that marked the beginning of justice, It was a quiet gaze that said everything without saying a word. Sheriff Kreel would later try to dismiss the encounter as misunderstood context, but it was too late. People had seen the tape, they had heard the shouting, and they had felt the power of what Elijah didn't say. Because in a world trained to only recognize power when it yells, Elijah Sorrell reminded everyone that sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do to a bully in uniform is nothing at all. When Elijah Sorrell pulled into his driveway later that evening, the sky had already dimmed into a shade of blue, so deep it swallowed the last traces of daylight. Street lamps hummed faintly, casting long shadows over the sidewalk as he turned off the ignition and sat for a moment in stillness. Again. The same stillness that had unraveled Sheriff Damon Kreel hours earlier now settled across his home like a second skin. No news vans, no sirens, no celebration. Just a man and a silence far older than that afternoon's encounter. But unlike Kreel, Elijah didn't flee from silence. He worked within it. Inside, the house welcomed him not with warmth, but memory. The walls hadn't changed in years. A half-withered ivy curled through the slats of a cracked kitchen window. A photograph near the hallway had shifted slightly on the wall, askew by maybe 1 inch, but he didn't fix it. Some things are more honest when they're imperfect. Elijah moved slowly, methodically, as if on schedule with something unseen. He didn't go to the fridge, didn't check his phone. Instead, he walked to the back of the house, down a narrow hallway where the overhead light flickered whenever it rained. The floor creaked beneath his steps, not a groan, but a whisper, like the home remembered him. At the very end of the hall stood a closet, with an uneven door and a silver handle dulled by time. It took 2 pulls to open, the hinges resisting slightly as if to ask, "Are you sure you're ready for this?" He didn't answer. He didn't need to. He crouched, pressed his palm flat to the closet's floorboard, then slid it sideways with practiced pressure. It gave way with a soft click, revealing a shallow compartment just deep enough to hold 1 item. A hard black case, thick with dust and memory. It hadn't been moved in over 7 years. He lifted it gently, like handling something sacred. Carried it to the small desk by the bedroom window. Sat. No theatrics. No music swelling in the background. Just breath. Just purpose. He unlocked it with a 4-digit code he hadn't said out loud in years. The numbers came back without hesitation. The date he resigned from federal service. March 22nd, 2018. The lock clicked. Inside was no gun, no cash, no secret badge or revenge manifesto, just a simple bundle bound in twine. Paper files aged into soft yellows, 2 cassette tapes, 1 digital voice recorder, and 1 envelope sealed with a government insignia that no longer held authority, but still held weight. Elijah didn't touch the envelope first. He pulled out the file on top and opened it slowly, like unfolding history. It was Kreel's handwriting, signed, dated, and authenticated. October 12, 2017. A confession, not just an admission of excessive force, but an ethical pardon agreement, issued after Kreel assaulted an unarmed 17-year-old during a routine stop. The boy had suffered a broken wrist. The department had claimed procedural error. But the truth had been recorded. Kreel had acknowledged misconduct, promised never to reoffend, and submitted to an internal correction process, one that Elijah had helped draft back when he still believed reform was possible inside the system. Elijah stared at the signature. Damon T. Kreel. Bold. Aggressive. A signature meant to intimidate. 7 years later, it was the evidence of a lie, because Kreel had reoffended. Not just that afternoon at the rest stop, but over and over, coated in impunity, protected by time, insulated by those who'd convinced themselves that silence was safer than truth. And yet, the truth hadn't disappeared. It hadn't expired. It had waited. That was the thing people misunderstood about time. It doesn't bury truth. It preserves it until someone with steady hands knows where to look. Elijah moved through the documents with the precision of a surgeon and the solemnity of a historian. One file after another, each one documenting the kinds of things institutions like to forget. Verbal abuse reports from patrol ride-alongs. A whistleblower statement that never saw the light of day. A voicemail transcript from a deputy warning that Kreel was losing control again. He paused on that one. Read it twice. Then slid it gently into a separate folder labeled Current Relevance. Next, he opened the digital recorder, scanned the files, found the one he remembered. Entry 17. Confirmed agreement with Officer Kreel. Verbal admission of excessive force on minor. Case number 4037. Statement given voluntarily. Closure signed under conditions of non-recurrence and retraining commitment. The voice was his own. He exhaled, not heavily, not with regret, just finality. This was what he had feared might one day matter. And now it did. Elijah never kept receipts for revenge. He kept them for truth. Because institutions forget. People forget. But paper doesn't. As he repackaged the files, something in the room felt different. Not haunted. Not vindicated. Just full. As if time had been holding its breath, waiting for this moment to arrive. He placed the original documents into a fireproof satchel, zipped it shut, and set it beside his desk. The black case, now empty but for the dust it had shed, sat open in the moonlight. He would not need it again. In that quiet, with only the sound of a clock ticking somewhere behind him, Elijah stood and looked out the window. The same oak that shaded his car earlier in the day now loomed in the night, leaves whispering something only the wind could understand. He wasn't angry. He wasn't plotting. He was ready to let the system taste its own reflection. Because the truth had not grown cold. It had grown sharp. And tomorrow, he would walk calmly, quietly, into a courthouse Kreel thought he owned. Not with accusations, not with rage, but with facts, with recordings, with signatures that couldn't be denied. Kreel wouldn't see it coming, because men like him never believe silence holds a memory. They think it forgets. But Elijah knew better. It wasn't the kind of case that usually drew a crowd. No media blitz, no dramatic opening statement, no high-stakes indictment on the docket. Officially, it was a procedural hearing, an internal review scheduled for 9 o'clock sharp on a Thursday morning. The language on the docket was bureaucratic and bloodless. Review of civilian interaction. Officer initiated. But behind the bland phrasing, everyone in that room knew what it was. A reckoning. Not because Elijah Sorrell had made a scene. He hadn't. Not because he had resisted arrest. He never did. But because someone in power had finally been caught in the spotlight of their own making. And the man who stood quietly at the center of it had the receipts. Sheriff Kreel entered first. Confident. Polished. A dark blue suit, tailored just enough to look official, but casual enough to imply control. He greeted the judge with a nod, gave a half-smile to the gallery, and took his seat at the right-hand table with the practiced air of a man who'd sat through countless hearings and always walked out untouched. His attorney, a sharp-tongued municipal lawyer named Vance Little, leaned in and whispered something that made Kreel smirk. It was the kind of smirk that forgets history isn't a rumor, that forgets paper can outlive pride. Then Elijah entered. No cameras clicked. No murmurs stirred the gallery. He wore no suit, no tie, no polished shoes, just a black collared shirt, clean slacks, and the kind of stillness that didn't announce itself, but changed the temperature of the room the moment it arrived. He didn't scan the crowd, didn't acknowledge Kreel, didn't bring an attorney, no folder, no binder. Just a man walking forward, step by step, like gravity itself had sworn allegiance to him. Kreel chuckled under his breath. "He came alone?" he whispered. But that wasn't true. Elijah had never been alone. He had the truth. And the truth doesn't need company. It needs daylight. The judge called the hearing to order. Formalities followed. Liddell began his argument by characterizing the rest stop incident as an unfortunate misunderstanding exacerbated by social media frenzy. He used words like de-escalation and miscommunication, implying Elijah had played to the crowd with subtle provocation, perhaps even baited the officer. Elijah didn't interrupt. He waited, because truth has never needed to rush. When asked if he had a statement, Elijah stepped forward, not to the mic, but to the bench. With both hands, he placed a sealed document on the judge's desk. Thick, stamped, official. Then, with calm clarity, he spoke. "This is a copy of the original statement," he said, voice steady. "Signed and sealed by Sheriff Kreel in 2016. It details a physical altercation involving a 17-year-old, unarmed and compliant. This document includes Kreel's admission of excessive force, the ethical pardon agreement, and his written acknowledgement that he would not reoffend." The room didn't gasp. It inhaled and held its breath. Kreel's smile didn't just fade, it collapsed. His lawyer went pale. The judge flipped through the pages, slow and methodical. Every flip of the paper sounded like a hammer, not falling, but winding up. Because the courtroom, stripped of spectacle, stripped of noise, isn't sacred because of its rituals. It's sacred because it remembers. And that morning, the room remembered everything Kreel hoped had been forgotten. Elijah didn't gloat. He didn't even look at Kreel. He simply stepped back and stood still, as if holding space for the truth to speak on its own. Liddell scrambled. He called the document inadmissible, cited contextual discrepancies, mumbled something about the limits of administrative ethics versus criminal action. But the damage was already done. The paper didn't lie. The ink hadn't faded, and Kreel's signature screamed across the top of that confession like a siren no one could ignore. In the silence that followed, something deeper than embarrassment settled over the room. Recognition. Not just of Kreel's misconduct, but of the pattern. The repetition. The arrogance. The certainty he'd never be called to account. Kreel tried to find his voice. He cleared his throat, leaned forward as if to speak, but the words didn't come. His mouth opened, but his jaw tensed. His eyes twitched left, then down. Then, just like at the rest stop, he froze, because there was nothing left to say that the paper hadn't already said louder. This wasn't about anger anymore. This was about evidence. This was about a line drawn in ink, then crossed in daylight. The gallery, once still, now leaned forward. Not with curiosity, but gravity. Everyone felt it. That rare, unspoken shift when a story stops being rumor and becomes record. Kreel's hand hovered near the edge of the table, gripping it like a lifeline. But nothing could anchor him now. Elijah turned, slowly, deliberately, and walked back to the bench. Not because he had more to say, but because he had already said everything without raising his voice. The court clerk reached for the document, carefully logging it into the record. A file once sealed in private, now exposed under oath. The judge looked over her glasses, face unreadable. She didn't need to admonish Kreel. She didn't need to say what everyone already saw. The system had failed once. It would not fail again. And yet, Elijah didn't come for vengeance. He hadn't returned to burn bridges or shame enemies. He'd come to complete something, to bring a cycle to a halt, not with fury, but with precision. The courtroom sat in stunned quiet as the hearing concluded. No verdict was announced, yet. But the message was clear. A badge wasn't immunity. A title wasn't truth. And the silence of a man who waited patiently to be heard had become a force no institution could ignore. As people filtered out into the hallway, one reporter muttered, "He didn't even bring a lawyer." And still, he ended him. But Elijah hadn't come to end anyone. He came to remember what had been promised, what had been broken, and what could no longer be buried. For a moment, no one moved. Not the judge, not the clerk, not the audience, just time, stretching thin across the tension in the courtroom like skin about to tear. Kreel's smirk, once glued to his face like armor, began to slide. Inch by inch, line by line, it collapsed under the weight of what Elijah Sorrell had just handed over. Not an accusation, but his own words. Signed, sealed, buried, and now resurrected. The silence didn't break. It deepened. Elijah didn't fill the air with commentary. He didn't look around to gloat. Instead, he calmly opened the folder he'd set on the corner of the bench, a folder so thin it seemed insignificant, almost empty. But inside was the sharpest weapon ever drawn in that courtroom, a printed transcript of Kreel's 2016 confession, typed neatly on official letterhead, bearing the unmistakable signature of both Kreel and his then legal representative, the same representative who now sat at the defense table, Vance Liddell. Elijah's voice was measured, almost gentle, as he read aloud, "I acknowledge the use of excessive physical force during the October 12, 2016 traffic stop. The subject, a 17-year-old unarmed male, posed no physical threat at the time of restraint. My actions, while unintentional in their severity, were not within the standards of conduct expected of my role. I accept the terms of internal pardon and agree that any future violation of such standards shall constitute cause for federal escalation." The courtroom breathed it in like smoke. Thick, slow, suffocating. Liddell's face paled visibly. One shade, then another, as if the blood had abandoned ship. Because there, in black ink, was not just Kreel's confession, but his own name. The man who had helped bury the document now sat watching it rise like a ghost with a memory too strong to stay dead. "You can bury a file, but not its echo." Liddell fumbled with his notes, flipped a page, cleared his throat, then leaned toward Kreel, whispering so furiously it resembled begging. Kreel didn't respond. He couldn't. His eyes were fixed on the document in Elijah's hands like it had teeth. Elijah turned the next page. "The agreement stipulates a period of monitored probation, with a condition of 0 recurrence. Any infraction henceforth will serve as immediate breach of ethical pardon, thus nullifying the protective parameters initially granted." It was not an attack, it was a receipt. The court stenographer didn't look up, but even her keystrokes seemed to hesitate, as if weighing the gravity of what she was recording. Across the aisle, a woman whispered, "He just read his own words back to him." That's when the collapse began. Not loud, not explosive, but like an old building caving inward under its own weight. No one shouted. No one needed to. Because this wasn't a spectacle. It was a reveal. And revelations don't need applause. They just need truth. Kreel shifted in his seat, posture faltering. For a man who had once barked orders with ease, he suddenly looked like a student caught reading from someone else's script. His hands clenched into fists, then opened, then clenched again. His mouth worked to form a rebuttal, but none came. Nothing in his training had prepared him for this. For a man who didn't threaten, didn't accuse, didn't speculate, Elijah was simply reading, page after page. His tone never rose. His volume never changed. But with each sentence, the courtroom sank deeper into awareness. Kreel hadn't just acted out of line. He had been enabled by silence, by paperwork, by those who had signed off on the lie and hoped time would keep it buried. But Elijah kept reading. "This is not a resignation of duty," Kreel had written in 2016. "It is a promise of correction, a commitment not to repeat behavior that violates the core ethics of public service." The commitment had failed, and now it wasn't just Kreel on trial. It was everyone who had signed, sealed, and shielded him, including the man sitting beside him now. Liddell finally stood, his chair scraping the floor like a dying breath. "Your Honor," he said, "I request that we—" But the judge raised one hand, palm flat. "Sit down, Mr. Liddell," she said. And for the first time in a long while, Liddell obeyed. Elijah closed the folder, not with finality, with clarity. The judge turned to the bailiff. "Mark the transcript as formal exhibit. Include the original dates, the signatures, and internal agreement codes. They are now part of public record." Kreel looked like a man drowning in his own reflection, and Elijah never even turned to see it. Instead, he remained still, gaze forward, hands relaxed, like a man who knew the weight of the truth wasn't in the performance, but in the presence. There were no headlines yet, no tweets, no viral sound bites, but inside that courtroom, something broke. Not Elijah, not the truth, the illusion that power was untraceable, that history could be rewritten by volume, that buried documents never claw their way back to the surface. Kreel lowered his eyes to the floor, and that, more than anything else, was the admission. He had no rebuttal, because this wasn't an accusation. It was his own voice, 7 years younger, coming back to testify. Outside, reporters waited for statements, but none came. Elijah exited through a side door, alone. No podium, no speech, just the soft, steady steps of a man who had spent years keeping quiet. Not out of fear, but out of timing. And now the echo had arrived, not with shouting, not with revenge, but with receipts, because the truth never forgets. It just waits until you have no room left to hide. The hallway outside the courtroom felt colder than when they had entered. The temperature hadn't changed, but something else had. The atmosphere. It hung heavy, like breath caught in a room too small for what had just unfolded. The doors clicked shut behind them with a sound softer than a gavel, but heavier than a sentence. And Kreel stood there, silent, still tethered to the table he'd once ruled from, his thoughts spinning while the rest of the room receded around him like a tide pulling away from shore. He didn't speak as Elijah approached, not because he had nothing to say, but because the words had all turned to stone in his mouth. Elijah didn't carry files anymore. No more transcripts, no more signatures, no more exhibits. Just a small square object wrapped tightly in black cloth. It looked unremarkable, something you might miss in a drawer or a coat pocket. But Elijah held it as if it were heavier than anything he'd carried that day. He stopped a single step away from Kreel. The sheriff didn't look at him. He couldn't. He stared instead at the floor, where his name no longer rang like it used to. Elijah spoke quietly, but the silence around them made every word a blade. "You should keep this," he said, offering the wrapped object. Kreel didn't reach for it. Elijah didn't insist. He simply set the bundle on the table beside Kreel's still hands and turned away without another word. Not to dismiss him, not to belittle him, to leave him with himself. There are confrontations that shake buildings, and there are confrontations that shatter people. This was the latter. The cloth was soft, worn. It unfolded with a slow sigh when Kreel finally unwrapped it, fingers stiff and uncertain. Inside was a simple mirror, square, metal-edged, the kind found in military barracks or in the glove compartments of old sedans. No inscription, no message, just one quiet object, one unforgiving reflection. Kreel stared into it. At first, he didn't see anything unusual. His face, his age, a few more lines than he remembered admitting. But as the seconds passed, his smirk, the one he'd worn like a shield for years, no longer appeared in the mirror. His jaw slackened. His eyes dulled. His posture, once proud, had begun to fold inward. The man looking back at him didn't wear the badge anymore. Not really. He wore emptiness. He saw not a sheriff, not a leader, but a symbol of decay, of arrogance, of a system that had rotted beneath the surface while still pretending to shine on top. It wasn't the mirror's surface that changed. It was Kreel's ability to see what had always been there. He remembered what Elijah had said days ago during the hearing, calmly, without bitterness. I pardoned you because I believed you could change. Maybe I was wrong. But now, you don't carry your title. You don't carry your name. You don't even carry your rank. At the time, Kreel had scoffed. But now, seated alone in the fluorescent quiet of a side hallway, mirror trembling slightly in his grip, those words echoed in him like wind through an abandoned house. The weight wasn't legal, it was existential. He had built a life on volume, on barked orders and slammed doors, on papers signed behind closed rooms and loyalty bought with silence. And now, all of it had been reduced to one reflection that refused to look away. His phone buzzed once, a message. He glanced down. It was from his daughter. One line, "You taught me to respect the truth, but you chose to bury it." No emojis, no follow-up, just the sting of clarity from someone who once admired him and now no longer could. He stared at the words for nearly a minute, then looked back at the mirror. Still there, still unforgiving, still him. He wanted to throw it, wanted to break it, wanted the truth to shatter into something he could sweep under the rug like everything else. But he didn't, because deep down, he knew what Elijah had known all along. You can silence a courtroom. You can manipulate a narrative, but you can't lie to your own reflection. Not forever. So he sat, with it, with himself. Later that night, Kreel went home to a house that felt bigger than it had the day before. Not because it had changed, but because he had shrunk. The chairs felt too wide, the rooms too quiet, the walls too honest. He placed the mirror on the mantel, then turned away. But he could still feel it behind him, watching. In the days that followed, Kreel tried to return to normalcy. He attended a local precinct event, shook hands, forced smiles, but his voice no longer carried the same authority. People looked through him, not at him. When he stood behind the podium, his jokes didn't land. When he spoke of duty, the words rang hollow, because everyone had seen the hearing. Everyone had heard the transcript. Everyone had felt the silence. And Kreel's collapse hadn't come with handcuffs or court orders. It had come in the form of an object small enough to fit in his palm. One mirror, one moment, one man forced to see what he had become, not by others, but by himself. And Elijah? He didn't follow up, didn't demand an apology, didn't appear on talk shows or give exclusive interviews, because he knew the real verdict wasn't decided in the courtroom. It was decided after, when the noise stopped, when the cameras turned away, when the only person left in the room was the one who had always been there. Yourself. It began quietly, as unravelings often do. No grand announcement, no dramatic fall from a podium. Just a morning where Sheriff Damon Kreel woke up, checked his phone, and found nothing. No messages, no updates, no calls from the usual names that used to light up his screen before breakfast. The same screen that once buzzed with opportunity, leverage, and loyalty now stared back at him like a flat line. And it wasn't a glitch. It was a verdict. The silence wasn't peaceful, it was pointed. He had been expecting damage control, a few loyal friends to circle the wagons, Maybe a sympathetic call from the local mayor or one of the county commissioners he'd helped out of tight spots more than once. He had even rehearsed a few lines, phrases like media manipulation, misinterpreted context, out of character. But no one called. Not even the ones who owed him, especially not the ones who owed him. Instead, the hours dragged by, each minute heavier than the last. At first, Kreel told himself they were just letting the dust settle, that things would bounce back. He had seen scandals before, weathered them, even. But by noon, the truth began to land, soft and brutal. No one was coming. And worse, they already knew. By 3 o'clock, Kreel began making the calls himself. First to his deputy, then to a longtime state senator he'd once helped out of an ethics scrape. Then to an old friend on the Federal Board of Enforcement Standards. The phone rang each time. But the results were always the same. No answer, no reply, or, on the rare occasion someone did pick up, a voice too flat to recognize. "I'm not involved in that anymore. Can't talk about this. Lose this number." Click! He stared at the phone after each call like it had betrayed him, but deep down he knew. It wasn't the phone, it was him. The silence that used to protect him had turned its back. Not violently, not angrily, just with precision, like a system trained to delete corrupted files without emotion. One by one, the walls began to fold in. An internal email circulated through the sheriff's office the next day, reassigned Kreel's public appearances to a lower-ranking officer. No explanation, just schedule change. His usual driver was pulled for other assignments. His access to certain confidential reports was quietly revoked. No formal memo, no confrontation, just institutional ghosting, systemic abandonment in real time. At first, Kreel stormed, slammed his desk drawers, demanded meetings, threatened lawsuits. But the louder he became, the more invisible he felt. Power built on silence doesn't respond well to shouting, especially when that silence no longer works for you. Because silence, when it isn't loyal, becomes a mirror. And that mirror now followed him everywhere. But it was the letter, mailed, not emailed, that finally broke something in him. Stamped in dark ink, Office of Federal Integrity. A sealed envelope, no warning, no preamble, just one request. You are hereby summoned to appear before a federal review panel concerning previously undisclosed ethical violations, specifically in connection to your October 2016 conduct and the subsequent terms of your pardon agreement. It wasn't from Elijah. That was the part that made his stomach knot. Elijah hadn't sent it, hadn't demanded it, hadn't even spoken publicly since the hearing. He didn't need to. The truth had done the work for him. The same system Kreel once used to protect himself was now, ironically, responding to its own failure. The paperwork Elijah had quietly unearthed, the same forgotten confession, had now triggered a ripple that no PR team could contain. Committees were forming. Panels were being assembled. Internal review boards, with names Kreel hadn't heard in years, were now preparing to shine light on everything he had worked so hard to bury. And it wasn't just the 2016 incident anymore. It was the pattern, the string of warnings, the complaints that never made it past his desk, the officers he intimidated into silence, the thin blue wall he stood behind while carving his own name into the fabric of impunity. Now it was all visible. And Kreel? He was radioactive. Sponsors pulled their donations from the annual sheriff's fundraiser. His old academy invited a guest speaker to replace him at a graduation ceremony. His face was removed from the promotional material for the regional leadership conference. Not replaced, just gone, as if he'd never existed. A digital ghost. He walked past a precinct monitor that usually looped department highlights. It now showed a placeholder, where his name used to be, "No current profile available." The badge still sat in his drawer, but it no longer unlocked anything. It was just metal. At home, the mantle where the mirror now lived haunted him. He couldn't bring himself to move it, couldn't bring himself to face it more than once a day. And yet, it pulled at him constantly, like it knew, like it was waiting. And when he did glance at it, what he saw wasn't just age, it was emptiness. A man stripped not by force, but by exposure. A hollow reputation where legacy used to be. He turned to the mirror one night, wine half drunk in his glass, and whispered, "I did everything they wanted, protected them, covered for them." But the mirror didn't answer. It never does. Because the lie wasn't that he protected others. The lie was that they'd protect him in return. The truth? They never intended to. They used him for exactly what he offered: silence, fear, spectacle. And the moment it stopped serving them, they dropped him like spoiled evidence. Because in systems like these, no one falls with you. They just step aside and let gravity finish the job. He sat in the dark for nearly an hour that night. Just him and the glow of the porch light from across the street. No phone calls, no news headlines defending him, no letters of support. Just a quiet so complete it rang in his ears. Elijah's name hadn't been mentioned in over a week, but Kreel still felt him, not as an opponent, but as a presence. The kind that didn't need to speak to be heard. The kind that never chased, but always arrived. And so Kreel waited, summons in hand, reflection in reach. The unraveling wasn't a fire. It was a quiet, merciless fade. And no one was left to turn down the volume. The room was hushed, but not because anyone had asked for silence. It came naturally, like a kind of reverence. The lecture hall at the university wasn't packed. Maybe 70 students, mostly law and ethics majors, a few professors in the back rows, and 2 journalists who had quietly slipped in before the doors closed. They weren't there for credit. They were there for him. Elijah Sorrell stood at the front, framed not by flags or banners, but by a simple projection screen and an oak podium that had seen decades of policy debates and commencement speeches. But there would be no slideshow, no handouts, no pomp. He hadn't come to teach. He had come to remind. He had spoken only once that semester. No interviews, no statements after the courtroom hearing. No follow-ups to the storm that had swallowed Damon Kreel and left behind a silence even the news couldn't fill. But here, at this lecture on institutional ethics and legacy failures, Elijah had agreed to say one thing, not because he sought applause, not because he wanted to leave a mark, but because the lesson needed to last. He stepped to the podium, his black shirt buttoned to the collar. No tie, no notes in hand. His presence alone held weight, not because of fame, but because of truth carried quietly. Students leaned forward, pens paused, screens dimmed, and then he spoke. "Don't let your silence be someone else's shield." 7 words, delivered low, clear, with no dramatic pause. The kind of sentence that doesn't rise, but settles, that buries itself in the marrow, that doesn't need repetition because its shape lingers behind the eyes long after the mouth stops moving. He didn't say more. He didn't need to, because everyone in that room knew what it meant. They'd followed the headlines, parsed the transcripts, rewatched the footage of Kreel's fall, the courtroom stillness, the unwrapped mirror, the unanswered calls. They understood the lesson wasn't about vengeance, it was about consequence. About how systems rot not from violence but from tolerated silence. From every time someone looked away and told themselves it wasn't their job to speak. When the lecture ended, Elijah was gone before the lights came fully back on. No Q&A, no handshake line. He exited through a side door, cutting across the quad before sunset. By the time students gathered their bags, He was already out of sight. He never stayed to be thanked. That was never the point. That night, the air felt different on campus. Cooler. Not because of the weather, but because of the finality that had arrived in silence. In a corner office of the Federal Office of Professional Conduct and Ethical Review, a clerk opened a small envelope hand-delivered by private courier. No return address, no logo, just a crisp white folder inside, sealed in minimalist gray tape. She opened it cautiously. Inside was a single sheet of paper, typed, unadorned. No heading, no footnote, just one sentence. Do not reinstate what was removed. No signature, no timestamp, just the weight of it. Like a gavel that had never needed to fall because the verdict was already understood. She flagged the file for review and forwarded it to the Ethics Commission's chair within 15 minutes. By midnight, it had been moved to a digital vault under the label Permanent Closure Request. Rollins, Sheriff Kreel. Code 44, Cod 17. The file wasn't inflammatory. It wasn't public. It didn't scream for punishment. It asked for continuity. That what had been removed, Kreel's name, his clearance, his rank, stay removed. Because some reversals aren't revisions. They're violations. The file was placed beside a sealed folder labeled simply, Elijah Sorrell, Record of Action, Non-Prosecutable. A record not of crime, but of clarity. A story preserved, not erased, because it had already done its work. Kreel, somewhere in the shell of the home he still clung to, didn't know the file had been sent. He wouldn't learn about it until weeks later, when an appeal to be relisted as a state-certified law enforcement consultant was quietly denied. No explanation. No open hearing. Just a polite 2-line email. Your eligibility has not been reinstated at this time. No further review is scheduled. He stared at the screen, but there was no place to respond. No one to argue with, just the silence that now ruled where his voice once roared. That week, a press outlet ran a piece titled, The Man Who Vanished Without Ever Disappearing. It wasn't about Kreel. It was about Elijah. About how some people don't need platforms or press conferences to change a system. They just need persistence and silence. Not the kind that protects power, but the kind that waits until the time is right to end it. Across the country, professors began referencing the case in classrooms, not as a lesson in law, but in integrity. Not in how to prosecute misconduct, but in how to document it until the truth can no longer be ignored. They taught students to archive, to prepare, to notice patterns and hold on to proof. Not for retaliation, but for the day it's needed. Because justice doesn't always arrive in court. Sometimes it arrives in a sentence with no name on it. In a file that closes because it must stay closed. At his desk, the Ethics Commission chair placed a red stamp on the folder's cover. Do not reopen. Underlined twice. Logged. Shelved. Back on campus, students lingered after class, still talking about the way Elijah had delivered those 7 words. Don't let your silence be someone else's shield. Some wrote it in notebooks, others shared it online, but no one forgot it. Because the words didn't just describe Elijah's journey, they challenged everyone else's. And somewhere beyond the reach of headlines, in a quiet corner of his study, Elijah lit a small lamp and placed a single index card in a drawer beside his desk. On it, he had written only this: What's removed in silence must stay silent. He closed the drawer, not as a declaration, but as an ending. The ceremony began like any other. Rows of pressed uniforms, polished boots, and family members clutching phones to freeze a moment that would mark the start of a career. The Sheriff's Academy graduation was held in the old Municipal Hall, a building with too much wood paneling and a history that could be felt in the grain of its floors. Flags stood neatly at the front. A brass band played softly. The cadence was routine, the speeches recycled. But today, something felt different. Not because of what was said, but because of what wasn't. In the second row of folding chairs arranged for honored guests, one seat remained empty. Not accidentally. Not overlooked. It had been placed deliberately, its edges aligned with the others, its back straight and unbent, but untouched by anyone. It sat directly beneath a single beam of sunlight filtering through a high window, as if the sky itself had chosen to point. There was no nameplate, no reserved marker, just a note, a folded piece of paper, taped to the chair's backrest, handwritten in bold, inked strokes. This seat belongs to the one who did not speak to win, but to be right. No signature, no attribution. And yet, everyone knew who it was for. Elijah Sorrell had not been seen in that town for months. He never gave interviews, never wrote a memoir. He never even commented on the quiet storm that had swept through the justice system and removed Kreel from every badge, board, and bulletin he had once graced. But his silence hadn't faded. It had deepened into something permanent, a new kind of presence, the kind that lingers not in headlines, but in culture, in protocol, in memory. The chair wasn't meant as tribute. It was record, proof that someone had once stood alone, not louder, but firmer, that he had once chosen not to retaliate, but to reveal, that he hadn't sought victory, but completion. The new sheriff, a younger woman with a no-nonsense posture and a quiet fire behind her eyes, stepped up to the podium as the final cadet received their certificate. Her speech was brief, no more than 5 minutes, and full of clean, clear language. She spoke of the badge as a burden, not a prize, of service as a promise, not a pedestal. And then, as her voice lowered slightly, she looked toward the empty chair. "There is no statue in the courtyard for the person this seat honors," she said. "No painting in the hallway. No plaque on the wall. Because this seat, this empty space, is not about being remembered. It's about remembering." The audience didn't applaud, not immediately. Some lowered their eyes, others nodded softly. It wasn't sadness they felt. It was recognition. The kind of recognition that comes when a truth once buried becomes a foundation. Behind the stage, the Academy's photo wall had been updated. Where Damon Kreel's picture once hung in a frame beneath a title etched in brass, there was now a blank panel. Not broken, not vandalized, simply removed. In its place was a small card tucked beneath the glass. This image has been retired in accordance with ethical reevaluation guidelines. Leadership is not a title. It is a responsibility. No one asked for explanation. They didn't need it. Not anymore. Because when a man like Elijah walks into a courtroom and speaks not to punish, but to expose, he doesn't just change the narrative. He changes what people expect from power. And in the months that followed his quiet dismantling of Kreel's legacy, things began to shift. Internal reviews were updated. Probation policies were rewritten. New hires were taught not only the law, but the history behind its misuse. Not everyone celebrated it, but everyone knew it happened. And the one who started it? He never returned to claim credit. While the Academy filed new graduates into departments and precincts across the state, Elijah walked university paths just before sunrise. He volunteered for guest lectures without name tags. He visited archives. He listened more than he spoke. And when asked directly about the case, he'd simply say, "It's closed," and let the silence fill what words could not. His file at the Federal Office of Ethical Integrity remained sealed. Not forgotten, preserved. And in the back corner of a quiet review room, beneath stacks of policy reform proposals, sat an envelope marked in red. "Do not reopen. Case reference, Sorrell 44. Inside was only one sentence. Still typed, still unsigned, still final. Some truths must remain closed to remain clean. It was not a cover-up. It was a conclusion, one the system finally accepted, not out of mercy, but respect. Back at the ceremony, the cadets were dismissed one by one, smiles on their faces, futures held out like badges waiting to be earned. The chair stayed empty. No one touched it. No one dared move it. And when the janitorial staff arrived that evening to clean the hall, the head custodian gave a quiet nod to the night shift. "Leave that one," he said, motioning to the chair. They did. For days after, visitors to the academy would pause at the chair. Some took photos. Others just stood quietly. A few left folded notes on the seat. Words of thanks, confessions, hopes. No one ever sat in it. Because some seats aren't meant to hold weight. They're meant to carry meaning. And some victories don't need witnesses, only proof. In the end, Elijah Sorrell didn't ask for applause. He didn't need to, because what he left behind was more powerful than headlines or viral clips. It was a blueprint. A quiet, deliberate lesson carved into the foundation of justice itself. For American citizens watching, the message is clear. The system doesn't fix itself. It remembers what we make it remember. It responds to silence when that silence holds truth, not fear. Elijah never shouted. He never weaponized his pain. He just waited, prepared, and let facts speak louder than fury. And in doing so, he exposed something deeper than misconduct. He revealed the fragility of unchecked power and the strength of quiet resistance. This story isn't just about one sheriff or one courtroom. It's about us, the witnesses, the voters, the neighbors, the students, the professionals who have a choice every day, to look away or to pay attention. Elijah's journey reminds us that truth is not always loud, but it is always lasting. One file, one sentence, one unshaken moment can spark a shift. So the next time you see something wrong, a voice silenced, a rule bent, a title abused, remember, you don't have to scream to make it matter. You just have to stay standing when it counts. That's what Elijah did. And now, an entire system remembers him without a statue, without a slogan, without even speaking his name. This is why we tell these stories. Not for shock, not for drama, but for direction. To remind you that justice doesn't come from noise. It comes from presence, preparation, and the will to carry truth, even when no one is clapping. So if this story moved you, if it made you rethink what silence really means, then do something simple, but powerful. Like this video. Share it with someone who still believes change only happens loudly. And most importantly, subscribe to this channel because we're telling stories that matter. Stories that don't just end, they echo. Because sometimes, the most important thing you can do in this country isn't to win an argument. It's to be right, and stay standing long enough for that to matter. Justice doesn't always need volume, but it always needs you.